What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit that like button and let me know what you think of today's very interesting discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sit Down video. What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another Saturday video. I hope you enjoy today's organized crime topic and the Gambino crime family. Recently, I posted a poll. What video do you want me to talk about today? Sometimes I leave it up to you to discuss. And over the last couple of weeks, I've gotten some people reaching out to me about Andrew Campos. Now, some people today say he is one of the more powerful people in today's Gambino crime family. And over the years, Campos is a very interesting individual. And I think there's a lot of question marks about this guy. What do we actually know about Mr. Campos? Today, we're going to delve into his story. Andrew Campos next on the Sit Down. Now, before we delve in to the biography on Andrew Campos, I want to right some wrongs that have been put out about Mr. Campos. And this comes directly from people that know Mr. Campos and have dealt with him at some point. There's this large thought that Andrew Campos he followed in the footsteps of his father. From what I understand, his father did not become a made man until Mr. Campos was made in the 2000s. So let's delve into it. Andrew Campos was born on February 17th, 1969, and grew up in the Bronx. Now, as far as I know, Andrew Campos's father, George Campos, who was born back in 1947, he grew up in the Bronx. He was actually born, as I said, in 1947, and his family lived on Hoffman Street, which is on not far from Arthur Avenue in the Italian neighborhood of the Bronx. Now, Andrew Campos would ultimately go to Mount St. Michael's Academy, which is in the Bronx, and he was actually a star football player. Here he can be seen throwing a football in a game in approximately 1986. It was said that Andrew Campos was a star quarterback on a very good Mount St. Michael's team. In fact, in 1986, he would be named an all-star on the Bronx Manhattan all-star team in New York City. Now, also on that team, and this has been widely talked about, you could see Andrew Campos in the number 7 jersey. On the far left in the same row is actually Sean P. Diddy Combs, who is a cornerback on the team. Now, it's said that Campos would maintain some sort of a relationship with Diddy into the 2000s. In fact, he would actually pop up at certain events for various members of the Gambino crime family in the 2000s. Now, from what I understand, they have not been in communication for the last probably 15 years or so, we would think. And I would think that Campos no longer wants to be associated with the disgraced Sean P. Diddy Combs. But I'm not going to delve too deep into that. That's pretty well known throughout the mob genre that at one point Combs and Campos were close. Now, in the early to mid 90s, Andrew Campos was, in his 20s. He would become connected to members of the Gambino crime family that were based out of the Bronx, most notably Salvatore LoCascio and Richard Martino. Now, as we know, LoCascio is the son of Frankie LoCascio. In approximately April of 1992, once LoCascio and John Gotti and others were taken off the street and convicted, LoCascio would take over his father's crew, and Richard Martino, who was a made member of the mob, would operate in Loke's crew. It's also said that as an associate, Andrew Campos was a driver for LoCascio at one point. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Loke and Richard Martino because at one point, John Gotti actually made comments surrounding Martino and Loke that they were the kind of the up-and-comers in the family. And at one point, Gotti would state, we're going to be real proud of these guys someday, and that they were, quote, beautiful guys. So I think Gotti kind of envisioned these were the future of the family. And obviously, Campos was an associate, but all these guys in Loke's crew were kind of the young guns. And we've seen this in other families, but A lot of those crews, farm crews and groups like that, were violent. These guys were more white collar. They saw the value of telephone companies, down the road, a budding internet business, taking the family into the 21st century, if you will. And down the road, they would have one of the largest consumer fraud cases ever, and they would make the Gambino crime family a lot of money. Let's delve into this scheme involving these individuals because it's kind of twofold. It first starts with telephone companies, and then it devolves into the internet. According to what we know, Torre LoCascio and Richard Martino were essentially given approximately $100,000, and they began investing it in adult entertainment, most notably through a person called Norman Chains, who was some sort of marketer in the New York area. Now, they would create small companies that were dedicated to 1-900 numbers that featured everything from psychics to phone sex operators. Back then, there was no internet, right? In the early 90s, essentially, people would call these 1-900 numbers, and you could get everything from, getting off to learning about your future to even like, I know back in the day, like you could get sports scores and betting information from things like that. And what these guys did is they used them to um, basically charge a bunch of money on people's phone bills. Now, according to the indictment, the scheme involved essentially uh, defrauding customers by causing phone companies to place unauthorized charges on telephone bills of victims. And to execute cramming schemes, defendants Richard Martino and others, together with employees of different businesses, produced advertisements offering free samples of adult entertainment services such as psychic hotlines, dating services, and sexually oriented talk lines over various 1-800 and 1-900 telephone numbers. Now, a company called Harvest would place these advertisements in various media, including adult magazines. Now, these advertisements, according to the indictment, induced victims within the Eastern District of New York and in the various states around the United States to call the various telephone numbers by promising free samples, but they were then front-end programs designed to charge the customers later. So customers would get their bill, and their bill would be several dollars more or $10 more, and they would either just pay it or they would begin complaining about it. And these companies were used to bilk customers out of hundreds of millions of dollars, which we'll get into. Now, a little bit more about this scam. Now, when a victim called the 1-900 number and expressed a desire to obtain a free sample of the entertainment service advertised, the front end program triggered a recurring monthly charge on the victim's bill for a voicemail service without the knowledge, consent, or authorization of the victim. Now, the bill would have monthly charges that appeared on the telephone bill, and they were designed to appear to be innocuous standard telephone charges and to conceal the fact that the charges were triggered by calls to the adult entertainment telephone line. So, this is pretty smart, and these guys engineered a lot of fake calls. Now, it was said that the Gambino crime family, in the end, would make hundreds of millions of dollars through this telephone scam. And between 1997 and 2001, just with the telephone stuff, they generated approximately $200,000 to $600,000 a day. And in the end, it generated approximately $420 million. Now, LoCascio and Martino and others down the road would even create a call center to handle customer complaints. So let's say you got a bill and you're like, what the hell is this all about? You call this call center and you're given the runaround. You're told that it's this, that it's that. And a lot of the time, people are just paying it because who really looks at that stuff? Now, down the road, Martino got smart. He decided, you know what? In 1996, we're going to use the budding internet to expand into the adult entertainment business. And by that point, people like Campos was an associate of his crew, which I talked about. Martino was president of a company called MyCal Properties, which had offices in Manhattan. He, Campos, and other people namely Thomas Puglisi, maintained not only phone services, but they also had companies dedicated to the internet. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this internet company because it's quite interesting. This MyCal company uh, eventually would go into a business with a company called Crescent Publishing Group, which actually opened up and had magazines such as High Society, which this is a cover of one of those. And they also had companies like Playgirl and all these magazines. And eventually they kind of get this magazine company to say, you know what, we'll allow your company to create internet websites that people can now jump onto from their computer because the internet's becoming a big thing at this point. So Martinez creates websites and offers free previews, if you will, where a customer would have to provide their credit card information to prove their age, and they were going to give something free. You weren't going to be charged for it. And as you know, if you came up in the 90s, 2000s, you likely remember stuff like this. You'd get a couple of photos or something, and in turn, it was just free. You didn't have to worry about paying. That said, as usual, on the back end, customer wouldn't be charged, but they had to enter their credit card information. And down the road, they would start seeing approximately $90 a month on a bill, and it would be extremely hard to cancel. So it got really difficult for the customer because they would try to cancel and there wouldn't be an X button or just be super hard to deal with. And at the end of the day, a lot of people don't even look at their bills and they're being charged 6, 8 months in a row for something they're not even using. We see today this even goes on. And there's actually companies now that you can pay to remove this stuff from your bill. I mean, how many people have looked at their bank statements and they see $9.99 that they've been paying for 2 years straight? You know, it's kind of interesting. This was being done back then, but it was significantly harder to cancel back in the day. In the end, this scheme between the telephone and the internet that people like Tory Loke, Martino, Andrew Campos, Zeph Mustafa, all these guys, it earned approximately $700 million in terms of gross revenue. And this would allow all of these guys to become pretty rich. I mean, Campos had $1 million plus home in Scarsdale, which is a suburb of New York City up in Westchester County. You know, these guys, and this is in the 2000s, early 2000s, they're making a lot of money doing this stuff. And it's all going up to the tops of the Gambino Crime Family. It's one of the largest consumer fraud cases of its kind. In the end, though, in 2003, all of the individuals mentioned were hit with wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy charges in a 20-count indictment released in 2003. I will, in the end, just talk about Richard Martino. He would down the road get 9 years in this case and have to give to the government approximately $9 million. I want to talk about Campos's role in this because it's important to understand he is still an associate of the mafia. He is not a made member. It was said that Andrew Campos operated approximately 8 shell companies. And he, was just part of the conspiracy in terms of the cramming and all that other stuff. Was he the creator of this scam? No. He was an associate of the crew, and he did his role in it. He had little shell companies, and he was paid to do this. He was not the originator of this. He was not the captain of this crew. He wasn't even a main guy at this time. Now, in this case, in approximately 2005, Andrew Campos got 21 months in prison, and he was hit with a 3-year supervised release after the fact. According to what we know, under Peter Gotti, it was said that Andrew Campos was made between 2003 and 2005. Now, I don't have any information on this ceremony. After 2000, it got harder and harder to get information on ceremonies, and I don't have much information on this. That said, I am going to talk about something that I got from a source. According to that source, they would state that under Peter Gotti, once Mr. Campos became a made member, he paid $50,000 to have his father, George Campos, made. There's this thought that George Campos was a long-running member of the mafia. That is untrue. As far as I know, he was just a regular guy. And up until his son was made in the 2000s, he was not a made guy. He may have had an association at one point with somebody, and he probably knew Frankie Logan, all these guys, but he was not a made member. And it's been discovered that he possibly had someone pay for his way into the life, um, which George Campos ended up doing. Now, he was quickly, Andrew Campos, made a captain in approximately 2004. Now, eventually, Andrew Campos did his time. He would be released. And down the road, Campos would create a construction company called CWC Construction Group. He also had a company called Eastern Interiors LLC, which reported and performed carpentry work in the New York area. It was also said that CWC's ownership interest included Richard Martino and associates of Campos's crew, including Vincent Fiore and Mark Kojai, were property managers, not property managers, job managers, not property managers, job managers. They were called project managers for CWC. And this is where yet another scam is perpetrated by Mr. Campos. Now, this is kind of confusing, a lot of these scams and things of that nature. And I'm going to read directly from the indictment that would come down in 2019 surrounding CWC and Mr. Campos. Between approximately 2018 and 2019, CWC, owned by Campos, paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes and kickbacks to employees of a real estate company called HFZ Capital Group and a person called John Seaman-Lakai. He's an Albanian guy and the cousin of Mark Kojai. These are two Albanians that were essentially associates of Mr. Campos. Now, Seaman-Lakai, this is kind of an interesting thing, so listen up. He was the managing director of HFZ Capital Group. Now, CWC paid the bribes in forms of hundreds of thousands of dollars of free labor and materials used for renovation on Seaman-Lakai's residence, which Seaman-Lakai failed to report as taxable income. And in turn, he gets all this free stuff and this, home renovations and stuff. And in turn, his realty group gives CWC all these jobs, these big, large construction jobs. And again, lines the pockets of people like Vincent Fiore and his captain, Andrew Campos. Now, in turn, as well, Mr. Campos was also doing other things that he should not do as a business owner. It's alleged that he failed to pay millions of dollars in payroll taxes after it was said that, guess what? He is paying people under the table for work that they're doing, and in turn also paying and charging people for work that's not even being done, all sorts of different things. So this was bad for Mr. Campos. He was making a bunch of money, but all of it was being done through bribes and things of that nature. Now, Vincent Fiore at one point was performing tens of thousands of dollars at work at a gym in the benefit of an employee of another real estate development company as well, in which they would agree to be fraudulently paid for billing the work to an unrelated project for another construction company. So this was a pretty large scale thing, and it was a fraud kickback scheme in terms of you're doing fraudulent things to get big, large construction projects that benefit you. Now, even Seaman-Lakai would be indicted down the road. Now, a lot of the evidence from this came from phone calls between Vincent Fiore and Mark Kojai. Now, Kojai, again, is the cousin of Seaman-Lakai. At one point on a wiretap conversation, Fiore is heard overtelling a cohort that, quote, Chippy, a.k.a. Kojai, is the cousin of Seaman-Lakai, and that Seaman-Lakai helps them, quote, get things done. Now, a few weeks later, Kojai is overheard telling Fiore, quote, that work on Seaman-Lakai's home was paid for by a change order for work that CWC had done for an HFZ building project. In another conversation, Fiore was overheard telling Campos that CWC owed a worker money for labor he had performed at Seaman-Lakai's home. Fiore would tell a cohort, quote, to bill 8 days of work at John Cy's house against 7611, which is the address 76 11th Avenue, and that Chippy knows about that as well, said Fiore. So again, all this coded language, all this is really good work done by the feds to uncover various scams going on, tax issues, all sorts of things in companies owned by Mr. Campos. In the end, they would all get indicted on this. And I want to talk about what was said about Campos. According to the indictment, Campos, quote, made extensive use of check cashing businesses and shell companies to illicitly funnel millions of dollars in cash out of CWC, and that he and Fiore used that to line their own pockets and fund other illegal activity. Now, between 2014 and 2019, Campos and Fiore caused CWC to issue over $2 million in checks to associates' businesses for work that was never performed. They also went to check cashing businesses and cashed additional checks and returned the money, often to Campos and Fiore to use. Now, money from other checks were used to pay bribes to different labor officials who provided keys to OSHA tests that many workers, including Campos's own father, used to obtain safety certificates that were required on New York City construction sites. So a lot of illegal business stuff done here. And again, a lot of labor construction stuff, but still making Campos a lot of money. Campos has a 5,500 square foot home in Scarsdale. He's a very rich man, multimillionaire, and all of it is pretty much done from scamming people. This is what these guys do. They are hawks. They are vultures. This is what they do. Now, I also want to talk about some of the violence in this case, per se, involving Campos's pals, including Vincent Fiore. At one point, Mr. Fiore, in a wiretap conversation on March 13, 2019, warned a victim that owed money to him, quote, when you get punched in the face and your teeth get knocked out, you're not going to laugh anymore, okay? At the end of the day, when you're upside down, unable to make payments, you deal with him, referring to the victim having to take things up with his powerful captain, Andrew Campos. Also, Mark Kojai gets in on the fun. He bragged in a phone call about his ability to violently collect money, stating that he could send a, quote, couple of my Albanian guys and have someone grab you by the fucking neck. Now, this would help Kojai collect over $30,000, also threatening that if a victim did not pay, he would, quote, get his fucking head split open. These are not guys to fuck around with in terms of Albanians. You know what they'll do. So, again, this is where you get problematic with some of your indictments because they use violence to do what they have to do. In the end, all of these guys would plead guilty, including Campos, Fiore, Kojai, and even Seaman Lackey, even George Campos. He would, though, avoid prison time. He had a pretty minor charge. For Andrew Campos, the writing was on the wall, and the guilty pleas would be in everything from racketeering to fraud and taxes. In February of 2022, Andrew Campos would be sentenced to 37 months in federal prison. He was released on January 29th, 2004. He is 55 years old and lives in Scarsdale, New York. As I said, has a huge home, very beautiful. You know, it essentially is on the corner of a property and wraps around to another street. Very nice home. And look, he has had to forfeit money, but I guess the government has been unable to provide other evidence that any of his other money has been gotten from ill-gotten gains. I want to end this video with a very interesting comment by a person called James Cahill, who was involved actually in a separate Gambino indictment a couple of years ago. He's one of the most influential union leaders, and he's the ex-president of the New York State Building and Constructions Trade Council. He was sentenced to 51 months in prison for taking bribes from the Gambino crime family as well. At one point in a wiretap, Mr. Cahill would regard Andrew Campos, quote, as Andrew. He's like the top guy right now. I'm close with Andrew. Now, this is pretty damning because you look at guys like Frankie Camuso, who were indicted recently. He's a Staten Island guy involved with the Gambinos, Lorenzo Menino, all these guys. They're very powerful. And I think down the road, Andrew Campos is a guy who would be on the hierarchy of the Gambino crime family. He is not someone who's just going to stop being in the mob and just do something else. This is what he does. This is who he is. And he's a very powerful individual. Now, I will also mention this. A lot of people are going to ask me about Mr. Campos' last name. Look, no one will ever argue that Campos is an Italian name. It is not. It is generally a Spanish last name, a lot of South American origin to that surname. As far as I know, now again, this is the Gambino crime family in the early to mid 2000s. This is not the Gambino crime family in the 80s. From what law enforcement says, they claim Mr. Campos was looked into about his heritage. Now, I will say this, according to ancestry and genealogy records, Andrew Campos's father, George Campos, his mother was absolutely Italian, as far as I know. But there are major questions surrounding the father of George Campos. Was he actually Italian? His name was also Andrew Campos. So Andrew Campos's grandfather, Andrew, we don't know if he was Italian. That said, maybe things were a little bit more lax in the 2000s under the Peter Gotti, Arnold Squitieri regime. I'm going to guarantee, and this comes directly from someone that I know, if this was the family under Frankie Loke or John Gotti, Andrew Campos would not have become a made member for sure. He'd be a powerful associate, but he would not be a made member. The rules have generally changed a lot over the years. In the end, though, Mr. Campos is a very powerful individual, and that comes from very powerful people and guys that know him well in the FBI, per se. As I said, Andrew Campos is 55. I hope you enjoy this video. We'll see you next week here on the Sit Down.